It has finally happened. Xi Jinping picked up the phone yesterday. He spoke with Ukraine's President Zelensky, and the result is this. Ukraine is sending an ambassador to China, and Beijing will send a peace delegation to Kiev. Also, China promises to be neutral in its mediation. Wonder how that'll work. But let's try to break it down. A phone call was long expected. Xi Jinping had not spoken to Zelensky since the war began, and yet the timing of this call is interesting. Also, the contents of it. China shares with Russia what it calls a no-limits partnership, but it tells Ukraine it will be neutral in the war. Seems like Xi Jinping is going out of his way to accommodate, which is quite unlike him. Is he doing it just to position himself as a peacemaker, or is he doing it as part of damage control? Because just a few days back, his top diplomat committed a blunder. He said former Soviet states are not independent, which also means Ukraine is not an independent country to begin with. Obviously, it met with an angry response, not just from Ukraine, but also many others in Europe. So by promising neutrality and reaching out to Ukraine, is Xi Jinping trying to salvage the situation? He made the phone call to Zelensky yesterday. It lasted for 1 hour. An hour-long phone call between two heads of state is a big deal. And what did Xi tell Zelensky? I have some quotes. China has always stood on the side of peace, he says. China will neither watch the fire from the other side nor add fuel to the fire, let alone take advantage of the crisis to profit. That's a clear jibe at America, the main ally of Ukraine, also the chief supplier of weapons. So China is positioning itself as the opposite of America. What does it propose to do next? Send a special representative to Kiev.
China will send special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs to Ukraine and other countries and hold talks with all parties on resolving the Ukraine crisis there.
What about Zelensky? What did he think about the phone call? Zelensky seemed cautious. He said the phone call was quote-unquote long and meaningful. We say that comment is polite and vague. The question is, will Zelensky accept China's peace plan? Will he negotiate with Russia, with China as mediator? He didn't say that. Listen to this.
Right now, there's an opportunity to give new energy to the relations between Ukraine and China. We also have the opportunity to use China's political power to reinforce the principles and rules that peace should be built upon.
Zelensky wants to see how this pans out. Don't we all? He's appointed an ambassador to Beijing. Remember, earlier Ukraine was quite eager to engage with China. Before the war began, in fact, Kiev and Beijing had good relations. By 2019, China was Ukraine's largest trading partner, and China too relied on Ukraine for many things, like barley, iron ore, corn, even defense supplies. In fact, Ukraine was China's second largest arms supplier, and there's an interesting backstory here. China's first aircraft carrier is a ship called Liaoning. It was a discarded Soviet vessel. Ukraine had it. In the 1990s, Kiev sold this aircraft carrier to Beijing. Then the Chinese Navy refurbished it, and it was put into service in the year 2012. That should tell you how deep the ties ran. But that was then. The picture has changed now. Russia's invasion has completely altered the dynamics. China may say it's a neutral player, but its actions do not match its words. China shares a close relationship with Russia, so much so that it does not even call the war an invasion. You know what the Chinese call it? A crisis. As vague and non-committal as it gets. And this is why Ukraine is wary of China's intentions. Plus, it has allies who are at odds with China, like the US. America has called the phone conversation a good thing that may not lead to anything meaningful. I have the statement from the White House. This is what it says. We welcome the news that there was a phone call between President Xi and President Zelensky. We think that's a good thing. Now, whether that's going to lead to some sort of meaningful peace movement or plan or proposal, I just don't think we know that right now. So the Americans are skeptical. What about Europe? Europe is doing what it does best, hedging. It says it's up to Kiev to decide what's best.
Peace will be decided, and it's up to Ukraine to decide in which terms. And in the meantime, we will continue supporting Ukraine. I very much welcome this phone call between President Xi and President Zelensky.
Russia too had a guarded response. The Kremlin welcomed the phone call, but Moscow still wants to continue fighting in Ukraine.
We are ready to welcome anything that could hasten the end of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia achieving all the goals it has set itself. As for the fact that they communicated, that is a sovereign matter for each of these countries and a question of their bilateral dialogue.
So those are the reactions. Now let's try to read between the lines. Why is Xi Jinping interested in Ukraine? What's driving his push to mediate? Of course, there's the appeal of being seen as a global statesman, but more than that, Xi Jinping wants to improve his relationship with Europe. China wants to separate Europe from the US. It wants to drive a wedge in the Western alliance and weaken American influence. It was on course to doing that, but first the pandemic hit, and then Russia's war forced Europe to reassess its ties with China. Also, America's trade war was putting pressure on the European Union. So this month, Beijing launched a charm offensive. First, it tried to court French President Macron. The gains were limited, though. A trade war with Lithuania intensified, and Brussels challenged China at the World Trade Organization. To make matters worse, a Chinese wolf warrior spoke out of turn. China's ambassador to France questioned the sovereignty of former Soviet states. It triggered a storm and uncomfortable questions for Beijing. If it doesn't even believe in Ukraine's independence, how can China be a legitimate peace broker? And that's when Xi Jinping had to come into the picture. He made the phone call when he did to try and change the perception about China's legitimacy as a mediator. But it may be too late. Unless Xi pulls a rabbit out of the hat, chances of him mediating in the conflict look bleak. Forget legitimacy, the Americans will not agree. And without them, the Ukrainians will not move.